Hello, I'm Chris McDonough with Inside Extension for Agriculture, and I'm working closely with Mallee Sustainable Farming on the Dry Saline Land project. And today I just wanted to look at how we can use seasonal rainfall events more strategically in our management of dry saline land, particularly on these bigger areas where land can change between seasons, and there's not a great capacity to do a lot of soil amelioration as such. So we've known for a long time with all saline management that the salinity of the topsoil can vary greatly between seasons. So you can have part of the season when it's highly saline, but after rainfall, after different weather, then that topsoil can actually be a lot more productive or even be able to germinate crops before going very, very toxic at other times of the year. So one thing with this project we've really noticed is that it's really important to take account of the top 5 centimetres of soil. And as you can see in this shot here, that after drought periods, the actual salt can really accumulate quite devastatingly in that top 5 centimetres. And in the past, we've just measured the top 10 centimetres. But because this is happening here, that's why it can be a lot more reactive to seasonal conditions. So one of the things we did in the project was to start measuring scalded areas, affected areas at different times of the year, of the season, and after rainfall events to see what sort of changes we were seeing. So here's a site with fairly heavy clay soil near Mannum, and we have done that. And here is, interestingly, the 0 to 5 centimetre levels from highly toxic, well over levels of 2. Once you're getting up to around 0.8 and 1, it's pretty toxic for plant growth. But you can see after the rainfall in that June, then it dropped right down and then started to rise even over the winter because we didn't have much rainfall. And then through November, December, dropped right down to even a level of 0.5, which is, possible to germinate and grow crops in. But then over the summer months just went skyrocketed and probably well beyond levels of 3. So that just shows the variation of that topsoil, particularly on in these type of clay environments or heavy soil surface. So here again is the 0 to 5 centimetre, whereas your 5 to 10 centimetre and your 10 to 20 centimetres and then below is much more stable and much less reactive. But also you can see here that when the rainfall comes, some of that salt has moved from the top 5 centimetres and then peaked a bit into the next layers down. So that is why it's important to understand this and how we can use this to manage our situations better. We also have a site here at Waikerie, which we did the same thing, a slightly sandy loamier surface with a bit of stone. And yes, we did see big differences in the top 5 centimetres. But also in this soils, a lot of the lower layers, the 5 to 10, the 10 to 15 did actually follow a bit as well, but the deeper soil layers stayed more stable at highly toxic levels. So there can be some differences after rainfall events in particularly that 0 to 5, and can we actually make the most of when it's actually possible to germinate and grow crops. So taking this information to the field, so here's a number of our sites. This was a heavy site at Manangatang. And so what I've done here is looked at the site, looked at NDVI imaging. So here's the map of the paddock, and here's the different seasons in the middle of the season, how it was growing, and then relating that to the rainfall we had, and particularly early or late rainfall or dry periods, to see how that season reacted in that paddock with the paddock growth. So just looking here, In 2017, we have fairly dry start. We have good March and April rains, and that has really caused, with the purpling showing, good plant growth. So that's been a good year to sow that paddock and get good responses. But if I just move myself out the road, this is the next 2018, a drought year. So we had a lot of no rainfall, hot weather, and all that salt coming to the surface. And so in the middle of the next year, hardly anything growing on that paddock, and a lot of bare patches, which is just contributing to more salt arriving at the surface layer. When we look at 2019, so again, really dry leading in. There was some May rainfall, which would have been useful, but because it come off 2018, big areas that were just too dry, too saline, and just did not grow at all in that season. So quite understandable. In 2020, I guess what we did find is, yes, we did have a dry leading into it, but there's 81 mils in April made all the difference. And so that proved to be a good season to go in. So get really good cover. All of the patches shrunk right down. And so it's a case of, can we make the most of those seasons by keeping that straw and not bearing it out in future years? In 2021 here, we see that really dry start of the season, never got that flushing of rainfall. And so, yeah, a really poor year for growth on that paddock, and a lot of bare patches and really poor growth. So just goes to show, without those opening rains, then, would you be better off not targeting that paddock or doing something different? When we look at 2022, obviously it was a very wet year. We had a bit of early rainfall, but then really good April and May. And as you can see, good coverage, good growth right across, and these saline areas have diminished quite a bit. But following on with that, in 2023, again, very dry over the summer, hot and dry. Some rainfall in March, which was useful. But yeah, increased size in all of the salt areas, and certainly some bare areas still through that time. And in 2024, I find this really interesting because we had 4 inches or 100 mils in January. But what happens in these situations, often on these salty soils with the salt through the clays, that it wets it up, and then you get lots of evaporation, capillary rise, and it can sometimes bring more salt into the surface. And you can see what's happened here, that with no rain following to seeding time, then that's what's happened, and we've got a fairly poor germination of plant growth right across that paddock. Here's another case over in Minnepa, and in fairly low rainfall area on the Eyre Peninsula. This farmer, Bruce Heddle, this was quite a bad area that all looked like this sort of patchiness, but he's actually has a chaff cart, and he spread a whole lot of chaff at the end of 2022, and has actually really made quite a big change on this patch. So we're talking about this patch here. And as you can see, again, I've looked at all the different years and tried to match those up with the rainfalls, and seeing whether, is it summer rainfall or autumn rainfall that's going to make the biggest difference. So quickly in 2016, you can see, it was a wetter year. There was some good early rains, and that carried right through. So quite a small patching area. 2017, while we had early rains, it looks like he hasn't sown this paddock, and looks fairly bare, and that would not have helped in terms of bringing more salt to the surface. In 18, again, that drought year, really poor growth anywhere. So there was very little cover, and that would have made these areas much bigger and much worse. But coming into 2019, what did we have? Very little summer rainfall there. So there would have been a lot of salt coming to the surface, but this May and June, quite decent rainfall that has flushed it out enough to bring these areas down, but there's still quite a residual salinity there from the drought, and still patches forming there. And I think this area has just been steadily been getting worse over time. I think that that's what happens with a lot of these dry saline areas, is that there's just an accumulation of salt over time, so that they don't recover so well after wet autumns. But in let me think, we'll keep moving. So to 221 here, again, not much rain at the start, but then this June rain really strong. So yes, there's areas of poorer growth, but not quite the bearing out that we'd seen before. In 2022, obviously very wet year that year, and the size of areas had reduced quite a lot, but there's still these strong areas of salt which still couldn't recover because they just haven't been maintaining cover over the summers. So, and in 2023, we just see this effect of putting all the cover over at the end of 2022, and having a whole summer where there's evaporation, the heat, the salt's not coming to the surface. And you see, even though it had almost no rainfall going into the start of the season, it actually turned out to be very productive ground, and just a change over one summer of cover. So really important to see that. So just also just talking about adding water, this is an area at Waikerie where summer rainfall actually caused ponding over this huge area here, and the effect of the dilution of the salt and leaching of it has actually led to that area covering. There's areas we also put strips of sand here. They did end up yielding better than just the flooding itself, but obviously the flooding did make a big difference, and there's bare areas that grew nothing where no water or no sand was put. This is also interesting because we've got here I put strips of calcium nitrate out and in the Mallee, and this is a dry saline area, but it just all got going on that first volunteer rain, and just shows that when the conditions are right, the seeds will grow and get going, and with the encouragement of the extra calcium nitrate really did get going. But then the farmer sprayed this out because he wanted to sow the crop, and when he did that, there was a period where it was left bare and dry again, and a lot of that salt did get back to the surface, but it still had made a bit of a difference having that extra cover. But I guess what I'm thinking from this is that often, if you can get in these bad patches and you get volunteer growth because you just get the right wet conditions when the seed's germinating, it may actually be better just to leave them as volunteer growth and keep that cover, and for the future and for the next summer, rather than spraying it all out, and then there could be a period before you sow a crop and it might not grow as well. So just in summary, having more strategic management around seasonal rainfall. I think it's really important around these bigger paddock areas with other fewer practical options. Really try to sow straight after rainfall as much as you can, and decent rainfall to get that dilution effect and a bit of leaching effect, because it might be the only chance you get to get cover on these patchy areas. And that might mean sowing a bit earlier or sowing a bit much later when that rainfall's come, or maybe even re-sowing some of the areas that haven't grown, because then you've got a big mid-season rainfall. Allow for more volunteer growth to cover, maybe, as I said. But it's an area that we really need a lot more work to do, so we can understand the different soil types, different situations, the amount of salinities, but most importantly, the amount of rainfall that's required and when, so that you can more safely go in with a cropping program over these areas to get more success. So hopefully this has been useful, stimulated some thoughts. Hopefully it'll generate some more work into the future. Thank you very much.